Thank you very much.
One of the things that I feel like we really need to talk about is the status or the state of the grid and what's going on there. And me and you just this week were in Portland for a couple days attending some power supply meetings. And honestly, I've been going to these meetings with you for 5 years now, and there's been times where I actually lose sleep over the state of the grid. I feel like it's a slow motion disaster and it's alarming what's going on, but there's not a whole lot of attention. I feel like it should be like on the front page of every newspaper in the region, but it's not getting that attention. And it's obviously having an impact on our rates as supply and demand is it's a supply and demand thing. But I think it would really be beneficial to go over some of what is going on in the grid right now, and what we're doing as KEC to help with the situation. I feel like we're one of many utilities in the region. We have some benefits in that we have a slice of the Bonneville Power Administration, like the hydro dams. Like we have that, but also it's a diminishing resource. But I'd love to hear you kind of explain that a little bit more. And I think during this part, we'd probably want to share some slides with our listeners.
Can I
Yeah,
just ask one thing
sure.
before you get into that answer? We talk about the grid a lot, and I just
Hmm.
think it'd be really
Yeah.
important to define for members who aren't in the weeds of power supply as much as we are. What is the grid? Is it Kootenai Electric's power lines? Is it Idaho's power lines? What could you just give us just a quick definition of what the grid is?
Yeah.
Let me do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doug's the expert.
It's all of that.
Okay.
I like to explain the grid like this. The grid is the most complicated machine ever built by humans. In the Northwest, it comprises over 20,000 miles of high voltage lines that provide power from central generating stations to loads like all of our members. So it's this living, breathing, pulsing entity that delivers power from the point of generation to the point of use. And if you can imagine this circulatory system of your body kind of being like the grid of the region, the veins and the arteries are what delivers power from those generating stations to loads. At any given time, power can be flowing. One moment it'll be flowing one direction, the next minute it'll be flowing another, just depending upon the loads of the system. The other thing that's important to consider is that we have a really hard time storing energy. So I always say that electricity is not able to be inventoried very easily. It has to be produced the moment it's consumed. So we have this issue of load following. When you turn on your light switch, there has to be a generation station or a generator operator somewhere that's turning up or turning down the power produced by that fleet of generation resources to make sure the power being produced at that moment matches the load.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. So to get back to your very terrifying question, it keeps me up at night as well. And for the last 3 to 4 years, we've been increasingly hearing this same narrative that we have a resource adequacy issue in not just the Northwest, but really nationwide. And what's contributing that? And what is resource inadequacy? So 70% of our power comes from the federal hydro projects that operate in the Columbia River system. We have access to this really inexpensive and renewable resource of generation that has been the bread and butter of the electric utilities in the Northwest. The other 30% of that has to come from other non-federal resources. And the reason for that is the dams are operating at capacity. We can't get any more power out of them than they already produce. The problem is that those dams, the youngest of them is 48 years old. I want to take a guess how the oldest one is?
Probably 80, I don't know.
116 years old.
160, okay.
Wow.
116 years old. And that's the fleet of generation assets that is powering 70% of our load. I talked about the grid. So that veins and arteries is delivering that 70% plus the 30% that we have to buy from other resources from the point of generation to our system comes across 20,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. Bonneville operates 75% of those. So they have about 15,000 miles of high voltage lines. The majority of those were built between 1940 and 1960. So what's the operational life of a transmission line? Well, it's quite long, but it's not that long. And those lines have to be upgraded, they have to be maintained, they have to be replaced. A wood pole, for instance, in a transmission system may last 50 or 60 years, but when it reaches its end of its life, it has to be replaced. And replacing that infrastructure costs a lot of money. And that's part and parcel of the issues that are driving our increased costs. Now, you talked about resource inadequacy. Another issue that I'd like to talk about, and let me just pull up a slide here.
For those of you listening and not able to watch this podcast, we will post all of these slides in the description of the episode. So we'll describe them well in the conversation, but you can also refer back to them later.
Yeah, so this slide that I wanted to review kind of highlights the issues that we're facing here. What you'll see on this slide is a graph that shows the percent of total power being used in the Northwest by source of power. So at the very bottom of the stack, you see the reliable workhorse of the fleet, hydropower. And stacked on top of it is this red bar of nuclear. And then right on top of that is the next workhorse of the grid, coal. And you can see back in 2005, coal represented about 50% of all power that was produced. Today, it represents a scant shadow of that, about 15%. And you can see going into 2035 with planned coal retirements, that is going to diminish down to about 7 to 10%. What's replacing it? Well, natural gas is replacing coal, but the two resources that the Northwest in particular are leaning really heavily on is wind and solar. Now, don't get me wrong. Wind and solar are great resources when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And the fuel is free, right? It doesn't cost anything for the wind to blow. And when the sun is up, that's a great resource to harvest energy from. But the problem that we're facing in the nation, and in particular the Northwest, is this whole issue of resource adequacy. And resource adequacy means when we come home at night and we turn our lights on, or we turn the stove on to cook dinner, we have to have enough resources to be able to serve that load at that moment. And if it's not windy and the sun is set, some other resource needs to be providing that power. And if it's not coal, then what's it going to be? Well, it's got to be natural gas. And the problem we're facing with the grid as a whole is we have less dispatchable resources available to meet that fluctuation in our day-to-day load than what the grid really needs. So wind and solar is great when it's there, but it has to be backed up by what we call a dispatchable resource. And the only dispatchable resource that we really have at our disposal is natural gas, if we're replacing coal. Because hydro is already tapped out, and nuclear is a great resource, but it's not able to follow load very well because it likes to operate all on and stay on all hours of the day, all hours of the month, all hours of the year.
So that, to me, that really highlights the need. One, you mentioned dispatchable, meaning like we can turn on this, we'll fire up this plant to meet the load when it's the highest during like the morning hours and the evening hours. But when there's a shortage of those resources, it's a supply and demand issue.
Very much.
We're having to pay more for it, and the region is paying more for it. It's not just us, but everyone. So it's a regional problem, and what are we doing to help with that situation at Kootenai Electric? What sort of influence are we having?
So this is a problem that's going on across the Northwest. Every utility in the Northwest is facing this same problem. We are in a little unique situation in that only 70% of our power comes from the Bonneville fleet. Many of our utility peers have not outgrown their allocation of that, and maybe they're only receiving maybe they only have to supply about 5% of their excess power. For KEC, 30% of our power comes from non-federal resources. We could go to Bonneville and ask Bonneville to also supply that piece, but then we have to be beholden to their policies and their costs. And it's an instrumentality of the federal government. And it's been our experience that while Bonneville has been a good energy partner in making available that inexpensive power that comes from the federal fleet, we don't feel that they've been a good partner in supplying that other 30%. So we've recently joined a power and generation cooperative called PNGC Power. We're one of 23 members of that organization who is self-reliant. We are developing our own fleet of resources that are serving that 30% of power. We're on the beginning stages of this. We have a long way to go, but we are looking at our own fleet of generation, including wind, solar, natural gas, geothermal. And we're making investments so that when we look back 20 years from now, that will be the resources that we own and operate to serve our aggregated needs of all 23 members of PNGC. So we're taking a very engaged and leadership role in making sure that we are self-determining our power supply future. And we believe that that's going to result in lower long-term rates. The unfortunate news is that these things take a lot of time. Let me just backtrack here. I think this is a really good moment to talk about the resource deficit we have and the reason why we have made this decision to be self-deterministic, if you will. If you remember back in January of 2024, we were having a winter vortex. The temperatures over that 5-day span of time was very, very frigid, record lows. During the height of that storm, the Northwest was importing 5 gigawatts of power from the desert Southwest through California into the Northwest to keep the grid stable. The grid threshold between the desert Southwest and Bonneville system was at its peak. They call that a congestion constraint, and there could not have been any incremental flow of power across that grid boundary. 5 gigawatts was as much as it could take. The resource that really kept the Northwest whole was the extra hydropower that Bonneville was able to get out of 4 dams that operate on the Snake River. They were able to ramp their production up just marginally to keep the lights on. The wind wasn't blowing that day. So all of these wind resources that we had in the Northwest weren't producing power. So in that moment of time, 2 years ago, we were deficit 5 gigawatts of power that had we not had the ability to wheel into the Northwest, we would have been facing rolling blackouts. The grid was that close. During that 5-day window of time, Bonneville was buying power out of the Southwest for $200 a megawatt hour and importing it into the Northwest for $1,000 a megawatt hour. All ratepayers in the Northwest, including those in KEC, paid their pro rata share of that freight. That's why it's so crucial that we build resources in the Northwest.
So we are short right now or more by 5 gigawatts. And so a gigawatt is about a million homes. I think of it as like a million homes. It's somewhere around there. So we're short right now 5 gigawatts. And in the future, we're going to be short even more, is what the forecasts are showing. And to give you an idea, there was some information that came out on a study that said we were going to be short 9 gigawatts by the year 2030, which is enough to power the state of Oregon, which is
mind-blowing.
Absolutely alarming to know that in just 4 years, the Northwest can't even have enough power for the state of Oregon. So where is that power going to come from?
And that's not even considering all the additional transmission lines that would need to be built. One transmission line per mile costs between $2 to $8 million. So start doing that math in your head and you arrive at a really large number. One other thing to point out is that the nation has built one nuclear generation station in the last decade. It was Plant Vogtle. It was built on a brownfield site, meaning it already had two reactors on it. They built an additional 2 more. It took us as a country 15 years to build that plant, and it was $20 billion over budget.
Wow.
Over budget. So now start thinking about the logistical challenge of building a whole fleet of generation. But that's the daunting scale that we're facing. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why our rates and the rates of every utility in the Northwest, really in the region, is going up so remarkably, is because those that are providing us power and those that are wheeling that power across their grid to our load is having to bake into the rates that they charge us to recover those costs. We're just now beginning to see the first fruits of that. And I don't want to alarm our members, but I think we would be remiss not to point out the obvious. This isn't something that's going to be cured overnight. This is rate pressure that we as a nation have to be ready to incur to operate a first world electric grid. If we don't incur these costs now, we're going to be like many countries that have third world grids that are exposed to power outages and rolling blackouts. And that is a nightmare that nobody wants to face.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as I listen to you talk about, you know, what we had happen in with this winter vortex and how we had to import power from the desert and, you know, and then go through the Cal ISO and export it from the desert and import it into the Northwest. It reminds me, and it almost answers another criticism, I guess, that we have heard occasionally, and that is that you know, Idaho is turning into, you know, California, or you know, how are the so I guess my question is how are the energy policies of other states, you know, affecting KEC? And you've touched on a lot of that, but I just want to rephrase it a little in terms of some of these comments that we've heard.
I would have to say that the conservative values that we all appreciate about Idaho are alive, well, and safe. The rates that we have designed are not a reflection of our desire to do anything like California has done, quite the contrary. However, I would also be amiss in not recognizing that the energy policies of other states aren't affecting the rates that our members have to pay. So this chart highlights this issue very well, Melissa. What this shows is if you look at that red line, that red dash line on this chart shows the average cost of purchasing power on the market year over year for the last decade, since 2017 to today. And what you'll notice in 2024, there was a market uptick, almost a doubling of market-based power. Reed, this gets back to one of the points that you made earlier, is that we're having a supply and demand problem. We have sucked up all of the additional firm capacity our generation plants are able to produce in the Northwest, and now we're having to rely on other resources like wind and solar to make up the difference. Well, why is wind and solar being built so much? Well, it's because of the renewable portfolio standards that have been implemented by states like Washington, Oregon, and California. The incentives that their portfolio standards have created for power generators is they penalize carbon producing resources like coal and natural gas and incent wind and solar. Well, you cannot rely on wind and solar to be there when the power is needed by our customers. So we have a diminishing portfolio of resources able to flex and follow load being replaced by these non-flexible resources. And this green bar at the very bottom that says Washington Climate Commitment Act perfectly coincides with the uptick that you see. And the reason is that utilities are now being billed for their carbon impact in Washington, and that is having a market response. And all utilities who rely on the grid are having to buy power at these elevated prices now. What's not shown on here is one additional program that is west-wide, grid-wide. It's called WRAP. It's a Western Resource Adequacy Program. And that program is designed to make sure that on our worst day, on the January of 2024, when the grid needs power the most, we have surplus capacity in our generation fleet to be able to serve that load. So that additional generation that is not currently connected to the grid also has to be built. And that's the reason why we are seeing such rapid year-over-year increases in power supply costs. It's going to continue, and unfortunately, it's going to take a long time to get us out of this tranche that we've been benefiting from for the prior 20 years. Mm-hmm. 5 years ago, I was able to buy power on the market for $30 a megawatt hour. Today, I'd be happy to buy it for 60.
Wow.
One question I'd like you to talk about briefly, if you could, though. Data centers is the buzzword in terms of causing a lot of this. And what I've learned over attending many presentations is there's so many different facets. It's easy to blame one thing. Data centers obviously have an impact. I'd like you to kind of expand on that.
So first of all, one of the things that we heard this week during the symposium that we attended was data centers are really necessary for our national security. So data centers are here to stay. They have a very high load. Just case in point, one data center is usually about 100 megawatts of load. So 10 of them would be 1 gigawatt. So that's kind of the scale that we're talking about. But they're necessary to maintain our competitive edge as a nation. And they're being built everywhere. And I don't want to dismiss the fact that data centers is causing an element of this problem. But frankly, most developers of data centers are not relying on their local utility to supply their needs. They're going out and they're finding their own generation resources to place on site to serve their own load. So they can avoid all the transmission interconnection because the point of generation is right there at the point of use. But that's not to say that that's not causing problems, because they're out competing for the same gen sets that all of the other utilities are needing to meet this additional 9 gigawatts of load that we need. But I would contend that data centers is only a fraction of the problem that is contributing to this. So this is a list of issues that I feel is influencing the pressures on the grid. Data centers, as you see, is at the bottom of the list. But a couple other issues that are factoring into this problem is the electrification of the transportation industry. My wife and I like to go out for breakfast on Saturdays. And we've been going to the same restaurant for years. And it used to be that in the parking lot, I would see a bunch of F-350 pickup trucks. And about 2 years ago, I remember walking out of breakfast that morning and being somewhat shocked to see 3 EVs parked in the parking lot of this very local restaurant. And I think we see this all over on our roads. The transportation industry is being transformed by electric vehicles. And what do when we come home from night? We plug that electric vehicle in, and that creates grid congestion. So it's not that the grid can't handle it, but it's important that that EV gets plugged in later in the evening after the peak use hours of the grid. Another one is the decarbonization of home and commercial heating. So this isn't as much of an issue in Idaho, but it is in Washington. If you're building a new home or you're renovating a home, you cannot install a natural gas heating system. It has to be electric. And guess what that electric demand is doing to the grid? It's contributing to that 9 gigawatts of power. We also are concerned as a society about the carbon emissions that coal plants have.
Mhm.
So we have been on this path of decommissioning coal-fired generation, which in addition to hydro has been the bread and butter of power generation in the nation as a whole. We also, you've probably heard stories in the news about the concerns that the 4 lower Snake River dams have had on fish operations and fish survivability and just the health of the river. I don't want to get into the science behind that, but what I do want to note is that those 4 hydroelectric dams account for 1 nuclear generation station. It's big. I guess the final thing that I would note that's causing grid challenges is just the reindustrialization of the American economy. We are trying to develop and build more domestically. I think we have seen a concern over the years of offshoring all of our industrial capacity. So all these factors are contributing to this need to reinvest and revitalize the grid, and that is expensive.